Hey everyone, let's do a video to help support your writing of Integration Paper 3. I'm going to start right here in around the year 1952 as we transition past World War II. We're going to see that a lot of the industry that really helped shape the middle class during World War II is now either being shipped out of the United States or being replaced by technological innovation. This is a process that we understand as deindustrialization. And so, in the deindustrial period in the United States, we're seeing the nation require different labor sources and different laborers. And so, during the Cold War, we see a huge kind of race to get to the moon, to get to outer space, to develop nuclear weapons. And as a result, in the effort to expand defense, new immigrants are now welcome into the United States. However, these immigrants are no longer the manual laborers and the agrarian agriculturalists that we saw in the early 1800s into the 1900s. Now we're seeing policy actually shape immigration as professionals, as scientists, right, as family members. And so in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act completely changes the way that we think about immigration and people of color. For the first time, we're seeing immigrants, for example, from places like Asia be able to get citizenship. And so, a lot of the things that we're going to see in the 1950s and the 1960s, in an effort to beat the Soviet Union to the moon and into outer space, we're going to see immigrants be welcome and, in some cases, promoted as assimilable citizens in the United States. So, what I want to do first is I want to kind of take a look at the table summaries of the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act and the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. Go ahead and click on the PDF link. I have it open right here, and I will just open it. So, your assignment asks you to kind of think about why African Americans, Jewish Americans, and Asian Americans all have these disparate outcomes in the post war period. And so, when World War II dismantled a lot of racist policies and desegregated things like the workplace, the school, the assumption was that everyone had these equal opportunities to become middle class. By the 1980s, we don't see that happen. We don't see that happen at all. We see groups like Asian Americans make it to the middle class in one generation, Jewish Americans the same, but the African American community very, very, very much is, right, still experiencing repression, economic depression, etc. So, part of the ways that we can explain this is actually through immigration itself. And so if you look at Table 4.2 here, the McCarran-Walter Act begins opening up the doors that modify the 1924 national origin system. We are seeing that if you're a spouse or a child of a US citizen, you can come in and you won't be counted against a quota. If you look at the first preference, though, in 1952, you see the United States are recruiting no longer the agricultural immigrant or the manual laborer. Their first preference is highly skilled immigrants whose services were urgently needed in the United States and the spouse and children of such immigrants. We're seeing that the quota said that 50% of the immigrants that we expected are largely going to be coming from skilled backgrounds, professions, already educated. And so you can kind of see by 1952, America is shaping immigration in such a different way that almost filters out people who will not be successful. These are folks that are going to make it to the middle class much faster than, for example, the immigrants who came in 1850 with no education, largely as manual laborers, and without family members. So in 1952, you can kind of tell that immigration policy is changing, that is geared almost directly towards professionals and family members, these two resources that really help, right, migrants thrive in the United States and will benefit Jewish Americans as well as Asian Americans as well. So if we look at Table 4.3, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 opens up the doors and doubles the amount of immigrants that are going to be expected into the United States. And we're seeing here family, again, is a huge, huge, huge component of immigration law and a predictable component of who we're going to expect in the United States. So in 1965, we're going to double the immigration limit, but now we're also going to see, right, an expansion of family members largely being sponsored over by professionals. And you're also going to see more professionals with, here, take a look at this third preference, exceptional ability in the sciences and the arts. And so, as we kind of think about why groups that were once, in some case, oppressed and once had no social mobility or no economic mobility, why we're seeing them thrive in the post 1965 era, it's not particularly all because of hard work, although that has something to do with it. A lot of it has to do with the immigration policies that facilitate the changing of the actual demographics of the community as well. So, for example, the 1965 Act is going to triple the Asian American population, and largely it's going to lean towards mostly professionals who are trained in the math and the sciences. Hence, what you're going to see is that stereotype that you may have heard that Asians are good at math. We know that that wasn't existing in the railroad building process, and you see here that the stereotype is constructed by policy itself. Now, if you think about why this policy did not benefit African Americans, I think this is a very important question to engage when you're thinking about writing this integration paper. So, will African migrants be able to immigrate as a result of the 1952 and 1965 acts? So, in some cases, we might see a trickling of African immigrants coming in through the professions, but really, if most of this immigration law is around family preferences, can African Americans actually identify family members 7, 8 generations removed from slavery? Probably not, right? So the idea that African Americans and their communities were able to reconstruct, right, through these civil rights policies is really kind of a flaw and a myth. And so while Jewish Americans and Asian Americans are reconstructing their communities through immigration, largely professional immigrants, we're seeing the African American community does not have the resources to do that, and, right, in many ways, are completely disconnected from family in Africa. Today, we might be seeing more African migration, but really in the post 1965 period, this was something that African Americans could not use to actually reconstruct their communities. And so I'm going to go ahead and minimize this real quick and come back to my modules. I don't want to go over every single component of week 11, but I do want you to kind of make sure that you're reading 11.3, The Drive to Excel in 1987, which is a media publication that celebrates Asian American success. As you're reading The Drive to Excel, I want you to kind of think about the individual that's represented. His name is David Kuo, and he's really celebrated as this hard-working Asian American kid. Take nothing away from David, most certainly is, but if you read behind David's experience, notice where he lives, what his father did for a living, what his mother did for a living, right? And these are all things that are driven by this 1965 Immigration Act. Before we actually get to the integration paper worksheet, a lot of the details are going to be in this Lee reading, The Watershed of 1965 and the Remaking of Asian America. But I also want you to kind of look at this article, Don't Tell Amy Chua, Mexicans Are the Most Successful Immigrants. So in thinking about what success means, Jennifer Lee asked the question, is success kind of like where you end up, or is success kind of like where you started to where you ended up? So check out that article and then go ahead and click on Integration Paper 3 worksheet. And so let me go ahead and download this really quickly and open it up. And very similar to the organizational worksheets that I assigned earlier, really I want you to really kind of think about some of the ideologies that are happening after World War II. That now that a lot of policies are changing to desegregate the workplace, to desegregate schools, there's this assumption that we live in a colorblind society, and oftentimes Jewish and Asian Americans are used to affirm that they were once people that were discriminated against, to some degree very much still discriminated against, but their economic status may imply that anyone of color can make it. We know this is a flaw, we know it's a myth, we just went over it, so make sure that you dispel it right here. African Americans are experiencing job loss because industries leaving the United States, and they're not able to reconstruct their communities through immigration policy. So one way that you can kind of see this is through the GI Bill and federal housing subsidies. This comes from the Brodkin reading, and it's going to come from that film, Race, the Power of an Illusion, that was assigned during the World War II week. So make sure you go back and look at that. Be sure you're using the Shelley Lee article, but really kind of draw from this Immigration Act of 1965 from the primary document and show that actually written in the policy itself is, right, a filtration system that guarantees that largely at least half of the migrants are going to come over as professionals or having family members here to support them. All right. And so as you're writing this, think comparatively, right? Yeah, most definitely. Hard work is really important in the United States, but hard work is often supported through policies. So the hard work of Jewish and Asian Americans, right, are supported through actual immigration policy change, whereas African Americans were not able to be privy to those types of changes. Good luck, and I will see you in the submission box.